The headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness as I rounded the bend near Ghost Creek. The old Utes engine hummed steady against the night silence. That's when I saw him, a figure standing motionless beside the cracked bitumen, thumb raised, but perfectly still, like he'd been waiting there for hours. Maybe days. I should have driven past. Every instinct honed by 20 years of Outback driving screamed at me to keep going, but something made me ease off the accelerator. The brake lights painted the scrubland red as I pulled over, gravel crunching under the tires. Through the passenger window, I got my first proper look at him. Tall, lean, wearing a checked shirt that looked like it belonged in my father's old photographs. Dark hair slicked back despite the wind that had been battering my ute for the last 50 kilometers. But it was his eyes that made my skin crawl, too bright in the headlight glare, like they were reflecting light from somewhere else entirely. He didn't move toward the vehicle. Just stood there, patient as a fence post, waiting for me to make the invitation. The rational part of my brain catalogued the wrongness. No sweat despite the humid night, no pack or swag, no water bottle. Nobody walks this stretch without supplies. Nobody. "You're right, mate," I called through the open window. He nodded once, deliberate and slow. "Need a lift?" His voice carried strangely in the still air, like it was coming from further away than his body suggested. I glanced at the fuel gauge, 3/4 full, plenty to get to Millfield and back. The supply run could handle an extra passenger. "Where you headed?" "Down the road a piece." Not exactly an answer, but I'd picked up plenty of taciturn blokes over the years. Station hands who'd lost their jobs, drifters moving between towns, indigenous fellas heading back to country. Most weren't much for conversation, especially not with strangers. I reached across and popped the door handle. "Hop in." The interior light flickered on as he slid into the passenger seat, and I caught a whiff of something odd. Not body odor or unwashed clothes, but something metallic and cold, like the smell of old rain on rusted iron. The seat springs didn't creak under his weight the way they should have. The door closed with barely a whisper. "Name's Jack," I said, pulling back onto the road. "Jack Morrison." My passenger stared straight ahead through the windscreen. "Good to meet you, Jack." He didn't offer his own name, and somehow asking felt like pushing against a door that was meant to stay closed. We drove in silence for 10 minutes, the headlights sweeping across the endless expanse of spinifex and stunted trees. This was country that swallowed sound and secrets alike, where a man could disappear without trace, and the earth would simply close over his absence like still water. I'd been driving these roads since I was old enough to see over the steering wheel, first with my old man, then on my own after he passed. Started as a station hand at Currajong Creek when I was 17, worked my way up to head stockman before taking over the supply runs 5 years back. It wasn't glamorous work, ferrying parts and provisions between the scattered properties, mail when the postal service couldn't be bothered, sometimes people when their vehicles broke down or they'd had a gutful of isolation. The country suited me, always had. There was honesty in the harsh landscape, a brutal simplicity that made sense after growing up with my father's silences and my mother's early death. Out here, you were either strong enough to survive or you weren't. No middle ground, no gray areas. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the familiar roads seemed to stretch longer than they should, the kilometers passing without the usual landmarks. I kept glancing at my passenger, trying to read something in his profile, but he might as well have been carved from the same red stone that jutted up from the surrounding plains. "You work around here?" I tried again. "Used to." "What sort of work?" He turned his head toward me for the first time, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, his face looked younger than I'd first thought. Mid-20s, maybe, with the kind of lean features that came from generations of hard living. But there was something timeless about him too, as if age was a concept that didn't quite apply. "Station work, bit of everything, mustering, fencing, bore maintenance." He paused. "You know how it is." I did know. Station life demanded versatility, the ability to turn your hand to whatever needed doing. But most of the properties around here ran skeleton crews these days, and I knew the faces of every hand within 100 kilometers. This bloke was a stranger, and strangers were rare in country this remote. Which station? Doesn't matter now. Another non-answer. I was starting to sense a pattern, but something told me not to push. There was a stillness about him that went beyond simple reluctance to talk, more like the quiet you found in old churches or abandoned homesteads, places where the past hung thick as morning mist. The ute's heater had been running since I'd picked him up, but the cabin felt cold. Not just cool, but genuinely cold, as if we were driving through a pocket of winter air that had somehow gotten lost in the Queensland heat. I reached over to adjust the vents, and my passenger spoke again. "Take the next left," I frowned. "There's no left turn for another 30 clicks. Just scrubland and there's a track, you'll see it." Sure enough, the headlights picked out a break in the roadside vegetation, two-wheel ruts worn into the red earth, heading west, into country I didn't recognize. The track looked old, almost overgrown, but definitely navigable. I'd driven past this spot dozens of times over the years. There had never been a track here before. "Where's this lead? Warrington?" The name hit me like a slap. I eased off the accelerator, staring at him. "Warrington's been dead for 40 years, mate. Ghost town. Nothing there but ruins and rabbit warrens. Not dead, just sleeping." His voice carried a certainty that made my spine crawl. I'd heard stories about Warrington, a small mining town that had thrived briefly in the 50s before the ore played out and the company pulled stakes. The residents had drifted away gradually, then all at once when the last of the infrastructure failed. By the time I was born, it was already returning to the earth. "Look, I can take you as far as the Millfield turnoff, but I'm not going bushbashing to some. You know the Donnelly place?" The words stopped me cold. The Donnelly place had been a small holding about 15 kilometers north of the old Warrington site, run by a family that had tried to make a go of cattle on marginal land. But it had been abandoned since before I was born. The house burned down in a grass fire in the 70s. How could this stranger know about something that had been gone for decades? "How do you know about the Donnellys?" "Used to drink with old Tom Donnelly every Friday night at the Imperial. Him and your father." The world seemed to tilt sideways. My father had never mentioned drinking with anyone in Warrington, had barely spoken about the town at all despite living in the district his whole life. And Tom Donnelly had been dead for 30 years. I knew because my father had helped carry the coffin. My father never. Bill Morrison, good man. Better than most gave him credit for. My passenger's voice carried a warmth it hadn't held before, like he was talking about an old friend. Had a way with horses that was damn near supernatural, could gentle the wildest Brumby just by talking to it. The description was accurate down to the last detail. My father had indeed possessed an almost mystical connection with horses, could calm animals that other men couldn't get within 50 meters of. But this knowledge felt wrong coming from a stranger, especially one who claimed familiarity with a dead town. "When did you know him?" "Long time ago. Before you were born, I'd reckon." I did the mathematics in my head. If this bloke was mid-20s now, he would have been a baby, if he'd even been alive, when Warrington still existed. Unless, I pushed the thought away. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe he'd grown up hearing stories, maybe his family had connections to the district. The Outback was full of oral histories, tales passed down through generations of drovers and station hands. But the cold in the cabin was getting worse, and despite myself I found the ute slowing as we approached the turnoff to the abandoned track. "Just take me to the old cemetery," my passenger said quietly. "That's all I'm asking." There was something in his voice, not quite pleading, but close to it. A weariness that seemed to go bone deep. Against my better judgment, I felt myself wavering. "There's nothing out there but scrub and dingo dens. There's more than you think." The headlights illuminated the mouth of the track, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw tire tracks in the dust, fresh ones, as if vehicles had passed this way recently. But that was impossible. Nobody had reason to travel this route, and the local council had long since stopped maintaining anything that didn't serve an active community. I sat at the intersection for a long moment, engine idling, weighing my options. Every rational instinct told me to refuse, to drop this strange passenger at the nearest town, and wash my hands of whatever game he was playing. But there was something else at work here, a pull I couldn't quite define. The way his voice had warmed when he mentioned my father, the certainty with which he'd described details that should have been lost to time, the track itself, appearing where no track should exist. 20 minutes, I heard myself saying. "I'll give you 20 minutes, then we're heading back to the main road. That's all I need." I turned the wheel left and felt the ute's tires bite into the dirt track. Almost immediately the ride became rougher as we left the sealed road behind. The headlights swayed back and forth, picking out the ghostly shapes of dead trees and the occasional glint of eyes in the scrub, probably wallabies or feral goats. But as we drove deeper into the abandoned country, something strange began to happen. The track, which should have been barely navigable after decades of neglect, felt solid under the tires. Smooth, almost, as if it had been recently graded. The vegetation on either side looked different too, less wild, more like the managed scrubland you'd find around an active settlement. I'd delivered supplies to dozens of remote properties over the years. I knew the difference between maintained land and country that had been left to its own devices. This place felt looked after, cared for, despite being officially abandoned. I checked the odometer, trying to keep track of distance, but the numbers seemed to be moving wrong, clicking over too slowly for our apparent speed. The dashboard clock had stopped at 11:47, though I was certain it had been working when I'd picked up my passenger. "How much further?" I asked. "Not far now." As if summoned by his words, a shape loomed out of the darkness ahead, a weathered timber sign, barely standing upright. The headlights swept across it as we passed, and I caught a glimpse of faded lettering. Warrington Township, population 340. Welcome. Population 340. That was wrong. In its heyday, Warrington had never housed more than a couple of hundred people, and by the time of its abandonment, the number had dwindled to perhaps 50 souls clinging to a dying dream. I was about to mention the discrepancy when the radio crackled to life. The sound made me jump. I'd had the radio turned off since leaving Kurrajong Creek, preferring the quiet of the night drive. But now it was broadcasting clearly, carrying voices that seemed to come from another time. Forecast shows continued dry conditions through the weekend, with temperatures reaching the mid-30s. This is 4KQ Brisbane. The time is 11:50 p.m., and you're listening to the Late Night Country Music Hour. 4KQ had switched to talkback radio 15 years ago. They hadn't played country music since the 90s. I reached for the tuning dial, but my passenger's hand intercepted mine, cold fingers that felt like they'd been submerged in ice water. "Leave it." The radio continued, playing a slim dusty song I recognized from my father's old vinyl collection. But underneath the music, barely audible, I could hear other voices, fragments of conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses. Barroom sounds, warm and convivial, totally at odds with the empty landscape surrounding us. I glanced at the temperature gauge and felt my stomach drop. The needle was climbing steadily into the red zone, despite the cool night air rushing through the slightly open windows. The engine shouldn't be overheating. I'd serviced the ute myself just 2 weeks ago, checked the coolant levels and hoses. "Something's wrong with the motor," I muttered, easing off the accelerator. "Keep driving. If she overheats out here, we're both walking home. Trust me." There was something in his voice, not quite authority, but a confidence that made me hesitate. The temperature gauge continued its relentless climb, but the engine note remained steady, no knocking, no irregularity in the idle. Just the gauge insisting we were moments away from catastrophic failure, while everything else suggested the engine was running better than it had in months. My passenger began to speak again, his voice taking on a dreamy quality that seemed to match the surreal atmosphere building around us. Old Tom Donnelly had the best cattle dog you ever saw. Blue heeler bitch named Rosie. Could work a mob of 1,000 head with nothing but whistles and hand signals. Tom used to say she was smarter than half the men he'd employed over the years. I knew this story. My father had told it to me as a child, word for word, right down to the dog's name. But he'd never mentioned meeting Tom Donnelly in person. Had always framed it as something he'd heard from others. How could this stranger know details that my father had only shared with family? "Your father was there the day Tom broke his leg mustering on the North Ridge. Carried him 2 kilometers to the homestead, then drove him all the way to the hospital in Millfield. Probably saved his life." The radio crackled again, and through the static came the sound of men's voices raised in argument. Something about cattle prices and government interference. The voices had the accent and cadence of decades past. The slightly formal speech patterns of men who'd grown up before television changed the way Australians talked. "That's impossible," I said, though my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "What's impossible?" "All of it. The radio, the stories, this bloody track that shouldn't exist." My passenger turned to look at me fully for the first time since entering the ute. In the green glow of the dashboard, his face seemed younger still, almost boyish, but his eyes held depths that suggested experiences no young man should carry. "Your father never told you about Ghost Creek, did he?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Ghost Creek was barely 5 kilometers behind us now, just a muddy waterhole and a concrete bridge that had replaced the old timber crossing. But my father had always gone quiet when the subject came up, changing topics or finding urgent work that needed doing elsewhere. What about it? Some places remember things longer than they should. Some places hold on to what happened there, especially when it was sudden, violent. The temperature gauge was now fully in the red, but the engine continued to purr like a contented cat. Outside the windows, the landscape had begun to change in ways that defied explanation. I caught glimpses of fence lines that looked too neat, too well maintained for abandoned country. A windmill turned lazily in the distance, its blades catching moonlight that seemed brighter than it should have been. There was an accident at Ghost Creek, my passenger continued, his voice now barely above a whisper. 3 young blokes coming home from a night in town, good kids all of them. Had their whole lives ahead of them. I knew where this was heading but couldn't seem to make my mouth work to stop him. My hands felt disconnected from my brain, maintaining steady pressure on the accelerator as we continued deeper into country that couldn't exist. Car hit the old timber bridge doing about 80, driver must have fallen asleep, or maybe the lights failed. Bridge couldn't take the impact, whole structure collapsed into the creek. Took them 3 days to find the bodies. The track ahead seemed to be pulling us forward with its own momentum, leading deeper into country that existed somewhere between memory and nightmare. Beside me, my passenger's voice carried the weight of decades of repetition, as if he'd told this story countless times to countless drivers who'd never lived to repeat it. When was this? I managed to ask. 30 years ago come next month. I should know. I was in the back seat. The words hung in the air between us, like smoke from a bushfire, acrid and impossible to ignore. I stared at the track ahead, my mind reeling as I tried to process what he'd just told me. The rational part of my brain, the part that had spent 32 years living in a world where dead men didn't hitchhike, was screaming that this was impossible, that I was having some kind of breakdown, brought on by too many long drives and not enough sleep. But the track beneath my tires felt real enough. More than real, actually. It felt better maintained than most of the roads I drove for work, smooth and solid, despite leading through country that should have been nothing but scrub and erosion gullies. I'd been delivering supplies to stations out here for the better part of a decade, and I knew every track, every gate, every bore pump within a 100-kilometer radius of town. This road shouldn't exist, but here we were, driving on it like it had always been there. That's not possible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I could hear how hollow they sounded. You can't be. I mean, you're sitting right there. You're talking to me. My passenger, I couldn't think of him as anything else, certainly couldn't think of him as dead, turned to look out the windscreen. In the dashboard's green glow, his profile looked even younger, barely out of his teens. When he spoke again, his voice carried a sadness that seemed to weigh down the air in the cab. I've been trying to get home for 30 years now. Keep finding myself back at that crossing, thumb out, hoping someone will stop. Most people drive right past, can't see me, I reckon. But every now and then, someone like you comes along, someone connected to the place. Connected how? The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but fear was starting to override confusion now. The temperature gauge was still buried in the red, but the engine showed no signs of distress. If anything, it was running smoother than it had in months, the familiar rough idle replaced by a purr that belonged on a much newer vehicle. Your father was first on scene that night. He was the one who pulled us out of the creek. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Dad had been a volunteer with the Rural Fire Service for most of his adult life, responding to car accidents and bushfires throughout the district. But he'd never talked about the work, never shared the stories that other volunteers sometimes traded over beers at the pub. Mum always said it was because he didn't want to bring that darkness home with him. The track ahead began to curve, following the line of what I knew should be Broken Hill Creek, though the watercourse I could glimpse through the scrub looked fuller than it had any right to be after 3 years of drought. Fences appeared on both sides of the road, not the sagging wire and leaning posts I was used to seeing out here, but neat, well-maintained boundaries with gates that still had their paint. This is impossible, I muttered, more to myself than to my passenger. The Hendersons abandoned their place out here in '98. The banks foreclosed, and the house burned down 2 years later. Did it? He nodded toward something ahead of us. I looked up and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, perhaps a kilometer ahead, warm yellow light spilled from the windows of a weatherboard farmhouse. Smoke rose from its chimney, and I could make out the silhouettes of outbuildings that should have been nothing but rust and rubble. It looked exactly like the Henderson place had when I was a kid, before the drought broke them and they moved to Brisbane. Jesus, I whispered. He's got nothing to do with this. my passenger said, and I caught what might have been dark humor in his voice. This is older country than that. Deeper. The radio, which had been cycling through its impossible playlist of voices and music from decades past, suddenly crackled to life with a clarity that made me jump. A woman's voice, tinged with worry. Mobile base to Unit 7, come in Bill, over. Static, then a man's voice, tired and strained. Unit 7 here, Jenny? We're still searching the creek downstream from the bridge. Water's running pretty fast after the rain, over. I reached for the radio dial to turn it off, but my passenger's hand shot out to stop me. His fingers were cold, not just cool, but cold like river stones in winter. Don't. You need to hear this. Unit 7, we've got the wrecker on scene now. Bridge is a complete write-off, took the whole structure into the creek. Have you found any sign of them? Over. A long pause filled with static, then, negative, base. But we can see tire marks on the approach. They were definitely traveling at speed, I'd estimate. Jesus, Jenny, they must have been doing at least 80 when they hit. The woman's voice came back, struggling with emotion. Keep looking, Bill. Their families are here. We have to find them. Copy that, base. Unit 7 out. The radio fell silent except for the hiss of static, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. My passenger was staring out at the farmhouse ahead of us, its windows glowing like beacons in the darkness. That was your father, he said quietly. Unit 7. He always responded to the bad ones. How do you know that? But even as I asked the question, I knew. Dad had been Unit 7 for the Rural Fire Service for over 20 years. He'd only stopped responding to calls after his heart attack in 2015, and even then he'd fought the decision to retire his radio call sign. Because I was there. Not in the water. I was already past caring about the cold by then, but I was there, watching him work. He was a good man, your father. Stayed in that freezing creek for hours, wouldn't let anyone else take the risk. My passenger paused, lost in memory. When he finally found us. What happened when he found you? He saw something he wasn't supposed to see, something that changed him. The farmhouse was close now, and I could make out details that shouldn't exist. A dog lying on the front porch. I could see its ribs moving as it breathed. Curtains in the windows, shifting slightly in what must be a breeze from an open door. A utility parked beside the house, its chrome bumper gleaming in the porch light. The Hendersons' place, I said numbly, but it's been gone for years. Has it? Or have you just been driving past it without seeing? I wanted to stop, to get out and prove to myself that this was all some elaborate hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. But my foot seemed disconnected from my brain, maintaining steady pressure on the accelerator as we passed the impossibly intact farmhouse and continued deeper into country that couldn't exist. The track began to climb now, following a ridge I remembered from childhood camping trips with my father. But the landscape around us was wrong, too green, too lush, like a drought had never touched this corner of the world. I caught glimpses of cattle in the paddocks, their eyes reflecting our headlights as we passed, standing in grass that should have been brown stubble after months without significant rain. Tell me about the accident, I said. I needed to understand what was happening to me, needed some kind of anchor in a reality that was rapidly becoming untethered from everything I thought I knew. My passenger was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years' worth of repetition, as if he'd told this story countless times to countless drivers who'd never lived to repeat it. My name is Marcus Webb. I was 22, just finished my apprenticeship as a diesel mechanic. The driver was Tommy Chen, best mate since primary school. In the front passenger seat was David Richardson, Davy, to everyone who knew him. The track crested the ridge, and I could see the creek valley spread out below us, silver water threading through stands of river-red gums that looked healthier than any I'd seen in years. This was the country of my childhood, the landscape my father had brought me to when he wanted to teach me about reading the land, about understanding weather and water, and the subtle signs that separated good country from bad. But it was a version of that country from decades past, before drought and overgrazing had changed it into the scarred, eroded landscape I knew it to be. We left the pub in Millfield around midnight, Marcus continued. Should have been home by past. Tommy's mum was expecting him. He still lived at home, was saving money to buy a ring for his girlfriend. Had it all planned out, where he was going to propose, what he was going to say. I could hear the pain in his voice now, the weight of futures that would never unfold. The radio crackled again, fainter this time. Base to Unit 7, come in, Bill. Unit 7 here. Bill, you need to come up for air, you've been down there for 40 minutes. The other boys can take over. Negative, Base. I've got something here, shine the spot downstream, about 30 meters from my position. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, knowing I was about to hear something I wasn't prepared for. Marcus seemed to sense my discomfort, but continued with his story. There was nothing wrong with the car, nothing wrong with Tommy's driving. We came around that last bend before the bridge, and suddenly the headlights just died. Everything went dark. Tommy hit the brakes, but it was too late. The track was descending now, winding down toward the creek through country that looked exactly as it had when I was 10 years old, and my father was teaching me to fish these same pools. But that was impossible. Drought and overgrazing had changed this landscape decades ago, turning it into the scarred, eroded country I knew it to be. We hit the bridge approach doing maybe 70, maybe 80. The timber railings gave way like they were made of matchsticks. The radio transmission continued, my father's voice hollow with exhaustion. Base, this is Unit 7. I've found them. A pause filled with static, and what might have been the sound of running water. Jesus Christ, what's wrong with their eyes? Unit 7, repeat your last transmission. Another long pause. Nothing, Base, just nothing. We're going to need the coroner out here. And Base? Go ahead, Bill. Don't let the families see them. Not like this. The transmission ended in a burst of static that gradually faded to silence. My hands were shaking so badly now that I had to grip the steering wheel with white knuckles to keep the ute on the track. Whatever my father had seen in that creek 30 years ago, it had marked him in ways I was only beginning to understand. I remember the sensation of flying, Marcus said quietly. Just for a second or two, feeling weightless, then we hit the water and everything went black. What did he see? I asked, though part of me desperately didn't want to know the answer. Marcus turned to look at me directly, and in the dashboard light, I could see his face clearly for the first time since he'd gotten into the ute. He looked exactly like what he'd claimed to be, a young man in his early 20s, with the kind of fresh-faced optimism that comes from believing the world is full of possibilities. Except for his eyes. His eyes held depths that no living person should possess. Shadows that spoke of 30 years spent watching the world change while remaining frozen in a single, terrible moment. He saw us as we really were, Marcus said quietly. Not the bodies in the water, but what was left behind. What couldn't move on. The track ahead curved sharply to the left, following the creek line toward what I knew had to be Ghost Creek Crossing. But this wasn't the concrete bridge and muddy waterhole I'd driven past countless times over the years. This was the old crossing, the timber bridge that had been destroyed 3 decades ago, its wooden railings gleaming white in our headlights. And scattered across the approach, glittering like fallen stars in the darkness, was broken glass. This is it, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is where it happened. The ute's engine coughed once, twice, then died with a shuddering finality that left us coasting toward the broken glass scattered across the approach to the old timber bridge. In the sudden silence, I could hear the creek running somewhere below us, the sound wrong somehow, too fast, too angry for the trickle of water that should have been flowing through the crossing at this time of year. I let the ute roll to a stop just short of the glass field, the headlights illuminating what I now realized were the remains of a windscreen, scattered in a pattern that spoke of tremendous force. The fragments caught the light like ice crystals, beautiful and terrible in the darkness. Why? I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was closing up. Why bring me here? Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt, when had he put it on, and turned to face me fully. In the harsh light from the dashboard, his features seemed to flicker between the young man who'd climbed into my ute and something else, something older and infinitely sadder. Because I can't finish this alone, he said. I've been trying for 30 years, walking these roads, catching rides with anyone who'd stop. But I can't cross over, not without help from someone who's still, he gestured vaguely at himself, still properly here. Cross over to what? Home. The word carried such weight of longing that it made my chest ache. I was going home to tell Sarah I'd changed my mind. About Melbourne, About the job, about leaving. I was going to ask her to marry me. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that glinted in the dashboard light. A small ring box, the velvet worn smooth by decades of handling. I had it all planned out. I was going to surprise her, show up at her parents' place and tell her I'd been a fool. The creak's sound grew louder, more insistent. Through the windscreen, I could see the timber bridge spanning the water, its railings intact, its decks solid and inviting. But I knew with absolute certainty, that if I got out of the ute and walked to where the bridge should end, I'd find nothing but empty air and the twisted remains of steel and concrete 30 feet below. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me to start the engine and drive away from this place as fast as I could. "You have to take me across," Marcus said. "Physical contact with someone living, someone with ties to this place. It's the only way to bridge the gap." He paused, studying my face in the green glow of the dashboard. "Your father understood, even if he never talked about it. He knew there were thin places in this country, spots where the boundary between what is and what was becomes permeable." I thought about Dad's silence whenever anyone mentioned Ghost Creek, the way he'd change the subject, or find urgent work that needed doing outside. I thought about the radio transmission I'd just heard, his voice hollow with an understanding I was only now beginning to grasp. "What happens to me?" I asked. "If I help you cross, what happens to me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of the ring box. "I don't know," he admitted finally. I think it depends on why you choose to help. Whether you're running from something or toward it." The honesty in his voice was worse than a lie would have been. I stared out at the bridge, at the broken glass that marked the spot, where 4 young lives had ended in fire and water, and tried to understand what I was really being asked to do. The weight of 30 years of trapped souls pressed down on me like a physical thing. I thought about Marcus, carrying his grandmother's ring through 3 decades of waiting, his proposal forever unspoken. About the friends who'd died with him, their futures cut short in a moment of mechanical failure and terrible timing. About Sarah, who might still be wondering what had become of the boy she'd loved. "Tell me about them," I said. "The others." "Jenny was going to be a teacher," Marcus said, his voice soft with memory. "She wanted to work with kids in remote communities, make a difference in places like this one. Dave was studying agriculture, full of ideas about sustainable farming practices. And Pete." Marcus smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the 22-year-old he'd been when he died. "Pete was going to be a mechanic, best hands with an engine I'd ever seen. He could make any car run, no matter how beaten up it was." "Like my ute?" "Yeah, like your ute." Marcus looked at the darkened dashboard, where the fuel gauge needle sat stubbornly on empty despite the half-tank I'd had when I picked him up. "He's been helping keep it running, trying to get us here, but his connection is weaker than mine. He was never as tied to this place." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "They're all here? All 4 of you?" "They're waiting," Marcus said. "On the other side. They can't cross without me, and I can't cross without you." Through the windscreen, I could see figures moving on the far side of the bridge, 3 shapes standing in the darkness, waiting. One raised a hand in what might have been a wave, and I found myself lifting my own hand in response. The weight of 30 years of unfinished business pressed down on me like a physical thing. I thought about Jenny, who would never teach children to read. About Dave, who would never implement his farming ideas. About Pete, whose gift with engines would remain forever unused. And about Marcus, carrying his grandmother's ring through 3 decades of waiting, his proposal forever unspoken. "If I don't help you," I said slowly, "what happens then?" "We keep waiting." Marcus's voice was barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "And you drive home, eventually, when the sun comes up and reality reasserts itself. You'll remember this as a strange dream, maybe, or convince yourself it was all exhaustion and too much coffee. But part of you will always know the truth." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, feeling the plastic warm under my palms. "And if I do help you? Then you'll understand what your father saw that night. What marked him so deeply, he could never speak of it." Marcus reached across the cab and placed his hand on my arm. His touch was real, solid, warm with circulation and life. The boundary between worlds is thinner than most people realize, especially in places like this. places where strong emotions have soaked into the ground. The figures on the far side of the bridge were clearer now. I could make out individual faces, young and hopeful, despite 3 decades of waiting. They looked like kids from any small town, the kind of faces you'd see in old-school photographs or faded newspaper clippings about local sports teams. Except for their eyes, which held the same depths I'd seen in Marcus. "Okay," I said, the word coming out before I could stop it. "Okay, what do I need to do?" Marcus smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, transforming his face with joy and relief. "Just walk with me. Hold my hand when we cross the bridge, and don't let go until we reach the other side." I turned off the headlights and opened the driver's door, stepping out into air that smelled of eucalyptus and running water and something else, something that might have been smoke or might have been hope. The night was cooler than it should have been, and when I looked up, the stars seemed brighter, more numerous, arranged in patterns I didn't quite recognize. Marcus came around the front of the ute, moving with the easy stride of someone young and healthy and full of plans for the future. He held out his hand to me and I took it, feeling his fingers interlock with mine. His skin was warm, his pulse steady and strong. "Thank you," he said simply. We walked together across the broken glass, our footsteps crunching on the fragments, but somehow never cutting through the soles of our boots. The timber bridge rose before us, solid and real, its railings gleaming white in the starlight. Below us, Ghost Creek ran full and fast, carrying the runoff from storms that had passed 30 years ago. Halfway across the bridge, Marcus stopped. "Can you see them?" he asked. I looked ahead and saw them clearly now. 3 figures waiting at the end of the bridge, young and whole and patient. Jenny, with her teacher's gentle smile. Dave, solid and practical even in death. And Pete, whose hands were already reaching toward the ute behind us, as if he could still feel the pull of its struggling engine. "I see them," I said. "Then we're almost there." But as we took another step forward, I felt something change. The bridge beneath my feet seemed to shift, becoming less solid, and Marcus's hand in mine felt suddenly cooler, less substantial. I could see through him now, could make out the railing behind his body like a double-exposure photograph. "Marcus," I said, panic rising in my throat. "It's okay," he said, but his voice sounded far away now, echoing as if from a great distance. "You're helping us cross. This is what it's supposed to feel like." Another step, and I could barely feel the bridge at all. We were walking on air, suspended above the rushing water by nothing more than will and need, and the strange physics of a place where time had folded back on itself. Marcus was almost transparent now, his features wavering like heat shimmer. "I can't," I started to say, but he squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Yes, you can. Your father did this too, in his own way. He bore witness. He saw us as we really were, and that seeing helped us hold together all these years." Marcus's voice was fading, but his eyes remained fixed on mine. "You're stronger than you know." We took the final step together, and suddenly the 3 figures were all around us, laughing and crying and embracing Marcus with joy that blazed like sunlight. For a moment, I was part of it, feeling their relief and gratitude wash over me in waves. I saw Jenny's classroom full of eager faces, Dave's experimental crops growing green in previously barren soil, Pete's hands bringing dead engines back to life. And Marcus, kneeling in a living room I'd never seen, slipping a ring onto Sarah's finger while she cried and said yes, yes, of course, yes. Then the light grew brighter, and they began to fade, becoming first translucent, then gossamer, then nothing at all. But their gratitude remained, settling into my bones like warmth from a distant fire. The last thing I heard was Marcus's voice, barely a whisper on the wind. "Tell her I made it home." I stood alone on the far side of the bridge, my hand still extended, as if holding someone else's. The night was quiet now, except for the gentle trickle of Ghost Creek, running through its normal channel 30 feet below. When I turned around, there was no bridge behind me, only the familiar concrete span with its steel railings, and the muddy waterhole that barely deserved to be called a creek. My ute sat on the far side, its headlights cutting through the darkness, engine idling smoothly. The driver's door stood open, and when I walked around to close it, I found a small ring box sitting on the passenger seat, old velvet, worn smooth by countless handlings, containing a simple gold band with a tiny diamond that caught the dashboard light like a star. The digital clock read 4:47 a.m., and as I watched, the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hint of dawn. I drove home through the growing light, the ring box secure in my jacket pocket, while the radio played nothing but static and the distant sound of wind through empty places. 3 days later, I found Sarah Henderson's address in the phone book. Sarah Murphy now, married 31 years to a wheat farmer outside Dubbo, mother of 3, grandmother of 5. I drove the 6 hours without stopping, turned up at her front door with my hat in my hands and Marcus's ring box in my pocket. I told her that someone she used to know had asked me to tell her he'd made it home. She took the ring box with shaking hands, opened it, and began to cry. Not the bitter tears of old grief, but something cleaner, more like relief. We sat on her front porch for 2 hours, while she told me about a young man who'd been too scared to stay, but too proud to admit he'd made a mistake. About how she'd waited for him to call long after everyone else said she should move on. I dreamed about him 3 nights ago, she said as I prepared to leave. He was standing at the end of a bridge, waving goodbye. He looked peaceful, like he'd finally found what he was looking for. I thought about telling her the rest of it, about the thin places in the country, about bridges that existed and didn't exist, about the weight of unfinished journeys. But some stories aren't meant to be told in full, and some kinds of peace are too fragile to examine too closely. Instead, I drove home as the sun set behind me, thinking about my father and the things he'd carried in silence, about the responsibility that comes with bearing witness to the impossible. The Outback is full of stories like Marcus's, tales of people who never made it home, dreams interrupted by distance and bad luck and simple human error. Most of them stay buried, becoming nothing more than fading newspaper clippings and weather-worn roadside crosses. But sometimes, in the thin places where emotion has soaked deep into the red earth, the boundaries become permeable. Sometimes the past reaches out to the present, looking for completion, for the chance to finish what was started. And sometimes, if you're driving the right roads at the right time of night, you might find yourself carrying passengers who've been waiting longer than you can imagine for someone to help them find their way home. That encounter changed something fundamental in how I see the roads I've traveled all my life. Every familiar stretch of bitumen, every dirt track disappearing into scrub, every creek crossing marked by a simple concrete bridge, they all carry the weight of stories now. Stories visible to me in ways they never were before. The Outback I thought I knew has revealed itself to be layered with memory, thick with the accumulated dreams and disappointments of everyone who's ever tried to cross its vastness. I still drive the supply runs between towns, still cover the same routes I've been traveling for 15 years. But now I notice things that were always there but invisible. The way certain stretches of road seem to shimmer differently in the late afternoon light. The places where the radio crackles with voices that don't quite match the frequency you're tuned to. The crossings where the air feels heavier, charged with possibility and loss in equal measure. Ghost Creek is one of those places, but it's not the only one. The land is webbed with them, and once you learn to see them, you can't unsee them again. 3 weeks after Marcus found his peace, I stopped by the old service station at Mallee Bend. The owner, Jim Hendricks, has been there longer than anyone can remember, dispensing fuel and local knowledge in equal measure to travelers passing through. I mentioned Ghost Creek while he was checking my oil, just to see how he'd react. "You been driving out that way much lately?" he asked, not meeting my eyes. "Been getting reports of people seeing lights where there shouldn't be lights, hearing things on the radio that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" Jim straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. "Voices calling out names of folks who've been dead 20-30 years. Music from radio stations that went off the air back when I was young." He paused, checking the oil level. "Last week, a truckie came through here white as a sheet, swearing he'd heard his own grandfather talking about a load of cattle he was supposed to deliver to a stockyard that closed down in 1987. I thought about the voices Marcus and I had heard that night, the fragments of conversations that seemed to drift through time like smoke. "You ever experience anything like that yourself?" "Once," Jim said quietly. "About 10 years ago, driving home late from visiting my sister in Broken Hill, radio picked up what sounded like a cricket match, complete with commentary and crowd noise." He screwed the oil cap back on, his movements deliberate and careful. Thing was, the commentator was describing plays and players from a match I'd attended with my father in 1971. Same exact match, down to the specific way the winning run was scored. Even mentioned the kid who caught a stray ball in the stands, which was me, age 12. He looked out at the empty highway stretching in both directions, heat mirages already beginning to dance above the asphalt despite the early hour. "Country's got a long memory," he said finally. "Sometimes I think the land holds on to things longer than we do, keeps playing them back when the conditions are right." I've heard similar stories from other drivers since then. Margaret Simpson, who runs mail between the smaller settlements, told me about regularly hearing her late husband's voice, giving her directions to addresses that no longer exist. A cattle transporter named Dave Walsh described picking up radio broadcasts of weather reports from the 1960s, complete with temperature readings from towns that have since been abandoned. Each story adds another layer to my understanding of what happened that night. Another confirmation that Marcus and I weren't experiencing something unique, but rather stumbling into a phenomenon that's been quietly occurring across the Outback for decades. The more I learn, the more I understand why my father never spoke about what he'd witnessed at Ghost Creek. It wasn't just the trauma of pulling bodies from wreckage, it was the recognition that he'd encountered something that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. My father was a practical man, someone who believed in tangible things, the weight of tools in his hands, the satisfaction of problems solved through honest work, the reliability of cause and effect. To acknowledge what he'd seen that night would have required him to accept that the universe was far stranger and more permeable than his worldview could accommodate. But his silence carried its own weight. I see that now, understand how keeping such knowledge locked inside must have affected him in ways that rippled through our family for years. The way he'd sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare out at the horizon, as if listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. The reluctance to drive certain roads after dark, always finding excuses to delay trips that would take him past particular locations. The habit he developed in his later years of leaving the radio on low all night, as if he was monitoring frequencies for voices that might drift across from somewhere else. When I was growing up, I interpreted his behavior as simple caution, the natural wariness of someone who'd seen too many accidents, who understood better than most how quickly things could go wrong on remote roads. Now I recognize it as the response of someone trying to navigate a world that had revealed itself to be far more complex than he'd ever imagined. Someone carrying knowledge he could neither share nor forget. I think about calling my mother sometimes, asking her directly about the changes she noticed in him after that night. But I suspect she already knows more than she's ever said. Farm wives from that generation developed their own ways of understanding and accommodating the inexplicable, not through direct confrontation, but through the kind of patient acceptance that comes from living close to the land and its rhythms. They learned to recognize when their husbands carried burdens that couldn't be spoken aloud, and they learned to create space for that silence, without demanding explanations. The understanding I've gained hasn't made me fearless. If anything, I'm more aware now of the weight of responsibility that comes with traveling these roads after dark. I know that every hitchhiker I encounter might be exactly what they appear to be, or might be someone whose story began decades ago, and who's been waiting all this time for the right person to help them complete their journey. The knowledge changes how I drive, makes me more attentive to the subtle signs that indicate when ordinary road becomes something else entirely. Last month, approaching a crossing near Millfield, I felt the familiar shift, the slight change in air pressure, the way the radio static arranged itself into almost recognizable patterns, the sense that the landscape was holding its breath. Standing beside the road was a woman in a floral dress that looked like something from the 1950s, holding a small suitcase and smiling hopefully at approaching headlights. I could have driven past. Could have told myself she was just another stranded traveler, nothing more complicated than someone whose car had broken down at an inconvenient time and place. But the set of her shoulders, the way she stood perfectly still as I approached, the fact that her clothes showed no signs of dust despite the dusty evening, all of it told a different story. I pulled over. Her name was Helen, and she'd been trying to get home to her children for 63 years. She'd missed the last bus out of Millfield on a Friday evening in 1961, had accepted a ride from a stranger who'd been drinking more than he'd admitted. The accident happened at the next creek crossing, quick and final, leaving her babies waiting for a mother who would never arrive. We drove through the night together, Helen and I, following roads that existed and didn't exist, past landmarks that flickered between then and now. She told me about her children, Tommy, who would be 71 now if he was still alive, and Sarah, who'd been born with a clubfoot but had learned to dance anyway. Helen had been working 2 jobs to save money for Sarah's surgery, had been on her way home that Friday, with an advance on her wages that would have paid for the operation. As we drove, the radio picked up lullabies she used to sing, weather reports predicting rain that had fallen decades ago, fragments of conversations from neighbors who'd watched her children grow up without her. Helen listened to it all with the expression of someone hearing familiar music after a long silence, occasionally humming along or adding details about the voices we were hearing. Mrs. Patterson always worried too much about her roses, she said during a gardening program that seemed to be broadcasting from 1962. I tried to tell her they'd be fine if she just left them alone, but she never believed me. The house we eventually reached existed in that same liminal space as the roads we'd traveled to get there. Present and absent simultaneously. Solid enough to walk up to, but somehow not quite anchored to any particular time. Helen stood on the front porch for a long moment, her hand on the door handle, listening to sounds only she could hear. They're not here anymore, she said finally, but not sadly. They grew up. They had good lives. Mrs. Patterson looked after them, and the surgery money came from somewhere else. Insurance, I think, or maybe the church. She smiled, and for a moment she looked less like someone from 60 years ago, and more like any mother whose children had turned out well, despite difficult circumstances. Sarah became a teacher. Tommy joined the army, came back, started a trucking business. How do you know all that? I asked. I've been listening, she said simply. All these years, I've been listening to their stories on the radio, watching them grow up in fragments. I just needed to see the house one more time, needed to stand where I belonged and know they were all right. When dawn broke, I found myself parked beside the ruins of a house that had burned down sometime in the 1980s, according to the historical marker that had been placed there by the local Heritage Society. But I could still smell Helen's perfume in the cab of my ute, still feel the warmth where she'd sat beside me through the night. These encounters have become part of my regular runs now, though not frequent enough to feel routine. Every few months, I'll pick up someone who's been traveling longer than should be possible, whose journey requires a living person to bridge the gap between what was and what is. I've learned to recognize the signs, to trust my instincts about which passengers need more than just transportation to their destination. Each story adds to my understanding of how the Outback holds memory, how certain combinations of place and emotion can create pockets where time becomes fluid. I've come to see my role not as someone who solves mysteries but as someone who bears witness, who helps carry stories across the boundaries that normally separate past from present. It's a responsibility I never asked for but have learned to accept, understanding that some forms of knowledge choose their keepers rather than the other way around. The land remembers everything. Every journey that ended too soon, every dream interrupted by distance or bad luck or simple human error. Most of the time, that memory remains buried, manifesting only as the subtle melancholy that hangs over certain places, the way some stretches of road feel heavier than others. But sometimes, when conditions align in ways I'm only beginning to understand, the boundaries become permeable, and the past reaches out for help completing what it started. If you find yourself driving through remote country after dark, pay attention to the hitchhikers waiting by the roadside. Most of them are exactly what they appear to be. Travelers in need of a lift. Nothing more complicated than that. But occasionally, you might encounter someone whose story began decades ago, someone who's been waiting all this time for the right person to help them find their way home. When that happens, remember that the choice is always yours. Remember too that some acts of kindness transcend the boundaries between worlds, and that the stories we carry, even the ones we can barely believe ourselves, sometimes need to be told to set both the living and the dead free from the weight of unfinished business. The next time you're out there in the thin places where the Outback shows its true face, where the radio picks up voices from other decades, and the road ahead shimmers with possibility, think about the responsibility that comes with traveling through country that remembers everything. Think about the people who never made it home, and the simple human impulse to help someone complete their journey, regardless of when that journey began. Stay safe out there on those long stretches of highway, especially after dark. Keep your fuel tank full, your phone charged, and your radio tuned to something familiar. And if you've ever driven the long roads at night, you know the silence they can carry. Hit like and subscribe. More stories from the thin places are coming.